Okay, shutter blades cleaning time now. Now these particular shutter blades are in quite a good state by the looks of them. I don't see any corrosion or anything on them, so it's much like doing the diaphragm blades, just using the lighter fluid on a cotton bud, and I will swab each of the blades in turn, and I want to remove the oil contamination from those blades. If the blades were heavily stained, which typically is corrosion, but it also could come from the oil being on the blades, then I would probably polish these with a bit of brass and then clean them carefully like this to remove any residue. But these blades are in very good shape. And so I won't have to bother with that. If oil sits long enough and dries out, all the volatiles go, it'll often leave like a lacquer behind, and sometimes the staining will be that lacquer. Now, those blades look good. Move those to one side there. That's our blade number one. You see it's got the extra hole, and pop that at the end of the queue so I know where it is. I'm just checking those blades in the light. I'm watching the reflection to see if there's anything I should be aware of. That all looks good. Now the mechanism plate. The mechanism plate I wanted to lubricate slightly with a bit of graphite powder, and I'm just drop a bit in here and work the blade actuating ring so that powder can drop down and to the meeting surfaces. That's all that's needed. It needs very little. Unlike a car engine that's doing thousands of RPM and turning millions of times in its lifetime, shutters only need to work very few times, 36 times for a typical film, and you'd be unlikely to burn an average of one film a week over any given length of time, unless you're a professional, in which case you can get yourself another camera. Right, so I'm blowing out that graphite powder. I worked a little bit into the retard gear train, a little bit into the mechanism. Now I've got to put the blades on. So, first thing I do, unhook that spring, swing that arm out, which puts our blade actuating ring in the position where the shutter blades will be open. And where do we start? That's the start position there. And I think I said that the blades were assembled in a clockwise fashion, didn't I? Not anti-clockwise. Let's do that then. I'm not overly convinced it makes any difference which direction you overlay your blades. Not in these shutters. In some shutters it might. There might be a reason why you would do that, start in one particular position, but these blades are all identical. The only difference is blade number 1, and that has the extra hole in it. That's the only difference. It's functionally it's the same thing. Alright, so there are our blades all sitting in position, and here's our case to fit over the top. Now we have 3 mounting holes, and they are not symmetrical, so we can find the place where they fit, and it will be here, here and here. I'll pop this over to one side because I've got to clear this little adjusting tab, and drop this case in place, lining up those 3 holes, and there are 3 screws. As always, I run the screws up, but I don't tighten them, because I have to be certain that the blades weren't disturbed as I put the case over the top, because otherwise the blades could be damaged. And it's not uncommon to disassemble a shutter and find that a blade has got a bend in it or a dent where someone has done exactly that. Alright, we'll flip that over, and now I'll check that the blades close, and they do. So I can hook that spring back over there. We'll go back and tighten up those 3 screws. And the shutter works nicely. I'll just take my blower, give that a good dust out, in case there was a bit of graphite powder still floating around. I don't think there was. Alright, so that's the tricky part of our shutter all dealt with. The diaphragm stripped, cleaned and reassembled. The shutter stripped, cleaned and reassembled. Now we just have the control components for the shutter to pop back in place. And just do these one at a time. And we'll start. We'll start with that flash contact. Now around that flash contact there was a lot of staining. It looked like grease or something of that nature. Where it had originated from, I don't know. Possibly something was splashed on the shutter, possibly someone grabbed the camera and adjusted the shutter and they had something nasty on their hand. Who would know? Best not to think about things like that. So this can go into place. Now these are often a very neat fit on the case. Some of them will install easier than others. It's a very tight fit. They're virtually jammed into that position. That's it. And it's held with a single screw. As the blades reach full open position, it should make this flash contact here so that the shutter is synced for electronic flash for all practical purposes. At that point there I can just see those contacts make, just because those shutter blades are reaching the full open position, and you could fine tune that to some extent. That's good. There's a speck of something floating on that blade. Let's blow that away. The B lever and its related screw, which is there. They can go next. Now these components are nowhere near as critical that these would be oil free as the blades. The shutter blades and that mechanism requires to be oil free, but these parts it's nowhere near as critical that these be oil free. We just want them clean so that they'll move smoothly. Let's pop that screw in there. Stand it up. As I said, that's a shouldered screw, and I don't want to over tighten it because otherwise that lever won't move freely. It's not playing the game today. Normally you can stand that screw up there. Perhaps it hasn't got as much lead on it as they normally have. They might have a little bit of lead. Just can't quite approach that correctly from that angle. It's better. Run that screw down carefully. I want to make sure that that shoulder centres in that lever correctly. It's playing a bit hard to get. That's better. Just nip that up. That's fine, that moves smoothly. These two components, this lever here, this is the return lever for the shutter release lever on here, and this was the high speed setting spring. So let's give these a quick wipe, make sure there's nothing on there that shouldn't be. No, that looks good. These parts are all pretty clean. Just that aberration of that brown greasy looking stuff. So I put a little bit of molybdenum on the pivot there where it runs over the post. That can be dropped down in place. There's its post there. This piece, I'll just put a bit of molybdenum in the pivot. And I'll see if I can get this into place. Sits over that post. You can see how it goes between the arms of that spring. Now I'm going to bring the spring round, and it tucks down into the case. There's actually a little groove inside the case that it tucks into. Make sure that that's free. A bit of a mark there, it's a fingerprint, but I think it's a long-term fingerprint. That's from somebody else. This lever of course is the catch that holds the shutter cocked, and I'm just checking the action of that. That's good. Getting this into position is sometimes a bit awkward, The hole it mounts into, there's a post on the base of that, the rivet, where it pivots, and that mounts into that hole. Well, that hole is right on the edge of a recess there, so it's hard to get this thing to drop in squarely, but that's the challenge of the day, so we'll do it. And that component was quite stiff to remove from memory. Checking that that looks in there, looks as though it's gone in square. Looks like it has. And here's its screw. Get that thing to drop in. That's better. Lift that up, that's good. Now that spring, the tail end of that spring needs to go in here on that B lever, so it needs to be lifted over. And it just tucks down underneath there. And so it spring loads this part, spring loads this part. The shutter release button or lever, just give that a wipe. Just having a quick look at that. You don't usually run into problems with this, but very occasionally on shutters that have been abused, the bush in the centre that it pivots on is loose, typically because this has been bent and it's actually loosened up that rivet. But no, that looks fine. It doesn't look bent. Sometimes the arm has been bent, typically in an attempt to make the shutter release earlier in the cycle or later. Now I just used a bit of molybdenum there just to lubricate that spot. And that just drops down in here, and you can see that this lever acts as a spring, return spring, to lift this back up. Now you can see how the tail of this bar, if it's sitting there and the shutter uncocked, you cannot depress the shutter release. If the shutter was sitting in the cocked position, that tail of that bar would sit into that gap, and then you can release it. Pop that to one side. Here we have the main drive ring, and I can feel the sticky grease on this. I want all of that off. You can see the staining there. That's good. This component's called the bird, or the bird paw. It's shaped like a bird. That's all there is to that. And that acts on this lever to open the shutter. So I'll put a bit of molybdenum paste on here, and I'll do the inside surface where it bears against the case. I'll do the outside surface where it acts on various levers, particularly this piece. And that catch, I'm going to want that catch is the catch where it holds the shutter cocked. This tab here is where it moves the retard gear train there. And so I put a bit of lubricant there and a bit there on that arm. And then fit this in place. So the spring goes in under there. Make sure that that B lever and that is all out of the way. It's being held up there and there. So I hold those pallets back out of the way, then I can swing that cam back out of the way. Make sure that the catch is free, and the spring needs to fit over that post there, and it does. Alright, in the meantime the shutter release lever had fallen off, and it's no hardship. So the cocking ring is all in place, and now I can fit this cam in on the shutter speed cam in place. So this looks a bit grimy. Of course it's had people's dirty fingers adjusting it on the outside. On the inside it'll just be traces of old grease and lubricants. That's not coming off too bad. I might have said it was grimy, but it's not too bad. Right, so I'll give that a wipe over. Make sure that I saw some bits of the cotton bud there, some threads. They're just trapped on that corner. I'll get rid of those. Some lubricant. So again, this is the molybdenum paste I'm using. You could be using graphite grease. You'd use it very sparingly. I'll do the inside edge. That's where it fits against the case, and if that's unusually tight or stiff, it just means it's stiff to adjust the shutter speeds. It doesn't really affect the working of the shutter itself. So those cam surfaces that the B lever and the retard gear train control arm run on, I've just run a little bit of lubricant on those. And there's one other spot. Now that high speed spring that brings in the 500th of a second, that runs through here and it's compressed when this ring is rotated. So I'm just making sure that that has got a little bit of lubricant on it, just because it's hard to move that lever on a good day. We don't want any fights. So this can pop into place. I'll just lift it over into position. Now the B lever is trapped under here, and I've got to make sure that that's free. Where is it? There it is. That's good. And I'm making sure that the arm on the retard gear train was not trapped in here or here out of the way. That in theory should go. So I'll slide that round to the B setting, cock it, and the shutter works. Come round to, this is the 10th of the second setting, and that looks very good. This will take us to the 25th, and that looks credible too. So that's all working as I would expect. I'm watching the flash contact here to see that it apparently makes, and it does. So that shutter's all basically done. It can be closed up. So here's our front ring, and just wipe that over with solvent, make sure I get rid of any rubbish. That looks good, and drop this in place. This pointer obviously is for your aperture settings, and it will line up with these numbers down the bottom. The ring only will drop in 3 places, but it'll only lock in one. You drop it into those notches, rotate it to lock it, and then this little lock screw needs to be rotated to lock it in position, to stop it rotating back again. That's close enough. That's close enough for me. If anything, that ran slightly fast, I would say, on the 10th. But it didn't run twice as fast, so we're good. That's pretty good. So that trim ring, that piece of paper is getting a bit grimy. That trim ring just needs to be wiped with a bit of solvent, just to remove any dirt. There's virtually nothing there. That can be dropped into place, and I can clean the lens sets front and rear and screw them into place. They look pretty good to me. They're a bit dusty at the moment, but that'll soon be gone. So virtually that's it. That's it for that shutter. And I'm sure you've seen me clean the lenses before, because there's not much excitement goes on there. Alright, quick clean of these lenses. Blow off the loose dust. A little bit of glass cleaner on a cotton bud here. That looks good. Screw that in place on the shutter. And we'll do the outside surface. The rear group, same thing. Always got to blow the dust off lenses you're going to clean. You don't want there to be any speck of abrasive dust on there that you're then going to be rubbing on the glass. Now, I can see a speck on the lens at that point there. It's not on the surface. I'm going to inspect that closely. It's somewhere. I can see its reflection off another surface too, so I can't feel it. I'm just touching the glass there with the end of a toothpick. And if it was a chip, I'd be able to feel it, and I can't. So it may be on the inside, maybe a speck of dust. I will look at that later and make my mind up about that. Oh, I don't like the look of that lens. There's a smear mark on the inside. Let's have another go at cleaning that. Sometimes it's hard to see how successful you've been cleaning lenses, particularly concave surfaces. It's hard to see exactly what's going on with them. Convex surfaces, flat surfaces, you can reflect light off them, you can see quite well whether there's any imperfection there. But concave, it's very hard, particularly if they are quite pronounced in the concavity. So I'm looking from the back. Yeah, that looks better. Oh, that's fine. Okay. Now, what else have we got to do to this shutter? Well, I've got my retainer ring and the shims I was going to pop back. So I'll just wipe around the inside of the retainer ring with a bit of solvent. That's nice and clean. I'll wipe the shims. First the metal shim, then the paper shim. Now I've got to be a bit careful here. These shims all have this notch in them, and that notch was used with some shutters as a locating pin. But on the retinas that was not a very common thing to happen at all. So the shims were made by some outside company, probably related to the shutter manufacturers, I would well think. And that little notch is irrelevant on the retinas, but since it's there, it means that you've got to deal with it. It means that the shims, particularly the paper shims, are quite vulnerable to tearing across at that point, so you have to be extra careful with your paper shims. So here's our surround that went on from the rear. This cutout here obviously fits over the flash terminal, which is there. So pop that in place, that's good. This piece here, this is the detent for our aperture settings. That has to fit into the case under there and under there. So if we do our screws up quite tight, that will stretch that case out, make this gap larger so we can fit this in place. Now, how does this go in? This scale is not symmetrical. The grooves are closer together at this end than they are at that end. This is the large aperture end, which in this case is at this end. So that slides in under there, pushed into the case at that point. Now I'll just spring this into the case at the other end. There it is, as simple as that. Now these two screws that I'd wound up, I will just release those and then tighten them up so they are just biting and no more. This case is basically held in place with its spring tension. Those screws just locate it to stop it from moving. Now our detent, I can feel the detent there for our aperture settings. That's good. That's a good feel. It's nice and smooth, but it's quite positive. So there's the shutter complete, and that can go back into the Retina II once I have finished cleaning and assembling that.